Do you know what? It was my birthday not so long ago, and somebody sent me a text message on my mobile phone. And there's one of these people who really like to let you know that you're getting old, you know. They said to me, you know, at your age, you'd want to start taking care of yourself and keeping fit. Because the older you get, the more you have to take care of yourself. And then the message went on and said, my granny, when she was 65, decided to keep fit. And she decided to walk 5 miles every day. She's now 97. We haven't a clue where she is. They're all in the school, all the wee 9-year-olds, and they're doing religion. And the teacher's there. She says, now, children, can any of you tell me how many were at the Last Supper? And wee Dan put up his hand. She says, yes, Dan. Please, mister, we're 14. She says, no, Dan, I'm sorry, you're wrong. There was 13. He says, no, mister, we're 14. She says, Dan, I'm the teacher. There was 13. No, mister, we're 14. All right, Dan, then who were they? Please, mister, there was our Lord Jesus Christ, and there was the 12 apostles. She says, that's 13. And the photographer. The Reverend Ian Paisley arrived at a wee primary school in Northern Ireland, and he went into this classroom of 9-year-olds, and they were doing English. And on the blackboard the teacher had written in big letters the word tragedy. So Dr. Paisley took up the theme and he said, well, children, he said, I see we're discussing the word tragedy today. Is there anybody here who can tell me what a tragedy is? And this wee fella put up his hand. He says, Dr. Paisley, he says, if I was going home from school today and I fell and broke my leg, he says, that'd be a tragedy. He says, no, my little man, he says, that would not be a tragedy. He says, that would be an accident. Anybody else, any idea what a tragedy would be? Another wee boy put up his hand. He says, Dr. Paisley, he says, if a car crashed and there were people killed, he says, that'd be a tragedy. He says, no, indeed, sir. He says, that would not be a tragedy. He says, that would be an accident as well. Is there anybody has any idea? Wee Dan Murphy down the back. Dr. Paisley, he says, Dr. Paisley, he says, if you were killed, that'd be a tragedy. He says, you have hit the nail on the head there, my little man. He says, that would indeed be a tragedy. And could you share with the rest of the class how you arrived at this conclusion? And wee Dan looked up and says, well, Dr. Paisley, says, my daddy always said that if you were killed, it certainly wouldn't be an accident. The two lads that were up walking in the hills, and they're walking around. The next thing they spotted this big hole, like a well, and they looked into it, and one says to the other, he said, I wonder how deep that is. I said, we'll tell you what we'll do. We'll throw a stone in, and we'll listen to the splash in the water down below, and that'll give us an idea. So they got a stone and they threw it into the hole, and they listened, and they heard nothing. And they said, well, maybe the stone didn't make much of a splash. So they looked around, they got a big rock, and they dropped the rock in, and they listened away for the splash. No splash. But jeepers, it must be very deep. So we'll have to throw something else. And they looked about, and the next thing they found this big railway sleeper, a big heavy 6 foot, 8 foot long thing. And they lifted it up and they carried it over to the hole and they dropped it in and they listened away. And as they were listening, the next thing they heard this noise coming behind them. And the two of them looked around. There was this billy goat charging at the two of them. Well, the two of them stepped to the one side and the billy goat jumped straight into the hole, straight down. The boys couldn't believe it. And then they were looking into the hole. The next thing, this farmer appeared up over the brow of the hill. And he says to the two lads, how are you doing, boys? Are you here long? I said, we're here a wee while. I said, why? He says, you didn't see a goat about? They didn't want to tell him now about the goat. He says, well, no. He says, there's a goat here. He says, I had him tied to a big railway sleeper. And what about the couple that were lying in bed one night at 3 o'clock in the morning? That's an Irish one. And they're lying there fast asleep, and a knock comes on the door. And she gives him a dig in the ribs. And she says, I think there's somebody at the door. So he gets up and he throws on the shirt and throws on the trousers and stomps down the stairs and opens the door, and there's this fella standing there. And he looks at me and says, what do you want? He says, I want to push. He says, 3 o'clock in the morning, you know what you do? Push off. Closed the door, stamped up the stairs, threw off the shirt, threw off the trousers, hopped into the bed, turned around to go to sleep, and she gave him another dig. She says, who is that? He says, some buck idiot, he says, at 3 o'clock in the morning looking for a push. So what did you do? I told him to push off, close the door. Be God, says she, you have a very short memory. What do you mean? She says, do you remember, she says, about 4 months ago, she says, our car broke down, and only for that man got up in the middle of the night and give us a push, we'd be there yet. And you know, I suppose you're right, he says. And he got up and he threw on the shirt and he threw on the trousers and he tramped down the stairs again and he opened the door and the pitch black outside, he couldn't see your man, so he shouted out, he says, are you there? Your man said, I am. He says, do you still want to push? He says, we got to do. Well, he says, whereabouts are you? Your man said, I'm over here in the swing. I had 18 bottles of whiskey in my cellar, and I was told by my wife to empty the contents of each and every bottle down the sink, or else. I said I would, and I proceeded with the unpleasant task. I withdrew the cork from the first bottle and poured the contents down the sink, with the exception of one glass, which I drank. I then withdrew the cork from the second bottle and did likewise, with the exception of one glass, which I drank. I then withdrew the cork from the third bottle and poured the whiskey down the sink, which I drank. I pulled the cork from the fourth bottle down the sink and poured the bottle down the glass, which I drank. I pulled the bottle from the cork of the next and drank one sink out of it and threw the rest down the glass. I pulled the sink out of the next glass and poured the cork down the bottle. Then I corked the sink with the glass, bottled the drink, and drank the pour. When I had everything emptied, I steadied the house with one hand, counted the glasses, corks, bottles, and sinks with other, which were 29. And as the houses came by, I counted them again, and finally had all the houses and one bottle, which I drank. I'm not under the affluence of alcohol, as some think a peep I am. I'm not half as thunk as you may drink. I feel so finish. I don't know who's me, and the drunker I stand here, the longer I get. This couple were invited to a fancy dress Halloween party, and they got their costumes and all. He was going as Batman and she was going as some other masked woman. And on the night of the party, about an hour before they left, she got a bad headache and she didn't want to go. So she said to him, go on you to the party and enjoy yourself. No point in you having a bad night either. So he went off in his Batman outfit and she stayed at home. But after about an hour or so, she felt a wee bit better and she thought she'd go and join him at the party. And as she was going to the party, she thought, there's no point in letting him know I'm here. She says, I'll just watch from the wings and just see what sort of nonsense he gets up to, or what sort of a boy he is when he's out on his own and he thinks I'm not watching. So she arrived at the party, and the party was in full swing, and the next thing she spotted him, the Batman outfit. Jeepers, he was after every woman in the place. He was reaching for a bum here and chatting up women and, getting a kiss. Oh my God. She thought so she thought she'd play a trick on him. So she went over and she started to dance with him. Of course, he wouldn't have known who she was. So the two of them were dancing away, and next minute she started to give him a bit of a cuddle, and then she whispered in his ear, and the two of them headed out into the bushes, and oh my God, I needn't go any further, but they had a great time. Anyway, she went off home before he was finished, and she was waiting for him to go home and to see what sort of an explanation he had for his behaviour. And when he walked in the door, she said, well, she says, had you a good time at the party? Had you a good time at the party? Well, no, says he, to tell you the truth, he says, there's not much fun without you. He says, so what I did, he says, me and some of the lads, he says, played cards all evening, he says, in the kitchen, he says, but the boy that I lent the outfit to, but he had some time.